I would like to recognise the traditional custodians of the land on which I am privileged to be recording this vodcast today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Hi, and welcome back to the Growth Distillery. I'm your host, Dan Kriegstein, a growth strategist and unapologetic consumer advocate. If you've just joined us for the first time, this is the vodcast where we explore the very many avenues for growth, regardless of economic climate, to empower you to make better decisions for your brand. What we cover off is grounded in the latest cultural and consumer research, and we explore it alongside some of the brightest minds in the country, and really get under the hood of the consumer psychology and the behavioural science of why we do what we do. In this episode, I've invited Rikki Pearce, the Managing Director of Verve Australia and the Global Lead for Verve's Centre for Advanced Analytics and Quantitative Research. The team at Verve have this really unique ability to uncover those surprise and delight insights that inform what I think to be a truly transformative consumer strategy. And they do this using their comprehensive research and analytics toolkit, which includes semiotics, social listening, advanced AI, and some really leading-edge quantitative methodologies. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with Rikki for a number of years now. I first met Rikki when she was leading the strategic insights function for Qantas Loyalty. But one of the more fascinating areas that Rikki and I have been recently exploring together are the changing dynamics of how we as consumers decide what we can and cannot live without, our essentials. And at a time where we are reappraising almost every aspect of our lives post-pandemic, and really staring down the barrel of what is going to be, the first economic downturn in over a decade, being deemed as essential is going to be your antidote to irrelevance as a brand. So then, how do you make your product or service more valuable to more people right now? Welcome to the show, Rikki.
Thank you, Dan. Great
I really
to be here.
appreciate you coming to have a chat.
Of course.
So before we dive in, just a little bit more, I think, about the backdrop of this research and why we've gone about exploring the changing ecosystem of essentials. You and I have done a raft of work on brands and brand switching, and I think we saw an explosion of brand trial and brand switching across the pandemic. Either through circumstances that we elected, using the novelty of new to sort of escape the everyday, or, circumstances outside of our control. Think, toilet paper shortages or 18-month long waits for cars. We've now got this compounding effect of the economic pressure to really litigate what we're going to continue to spend on and what we're not. And I think that, this 1-2 double of the emergence of, brand trial compounded with, am I going to spend on A or am I going to spend on B and what am I going to spend on, I think has created a really, really important context for marketers and for brands to understand how people are going to go and choose what they can and can't live without. So what I'd love to get your take on, I'd love to get a little bit about the research and the methodology, because I think that you guys have done some truly groundbreaking work with this work.
Yeah, amazing. And thanks again for having us. We threw the kitchen sink at it. We felt that a big, meaty problem like this needed to be looked at from a number of different angles. And so we jumped in and we looked at some cultural landscaping. We got a barometer read on how people are feeling, what they are planning to do and what they're claiming to do. And then we actually looked at what people are spending their money on. So we got their actual spend data on a one-to-one basis. And the really illuminating insights, I think, came from the intersection of these and where we could see there were differences and discrepancies. And that's what's really interesting about the work and really interesting for marketers, I think, as we go into rolling it out.
Yeah, awesome. So give me an example, I think, of one of the really illuminating discrepancies between what people were thinking or at least planning to do in terms of their behaviour and what we've seen when we link it to really what they are actually spending on.
Yes, so we asked people how they changed their spending in the last 6 months, and we found across all categories that people were wrong. They actually had not done what they thought they had done. And the really alarming part of that is that they're actually spending more in 99% of categories than they believe they are. So
interesting. So despite the storm clouds forming, We know that freight train's coming in terms of, the tightening of the economic screws this coming year. We still are terrible mental accountants, is what you're telling me.
Terrible mental accountants,
Okay.
yes.
So then what's going on right now? Despite us knowing that the flood is coming, so to speak, why is it, do you think, that we are still in this moment of blissful ignorance?
It's a really interesting question, and I think people have always been terrible budgeters. That's not new, but the circumstances are very novel. You've mentioned two moments, you've mentioned two macro factors.
Yep.
And they are really heating the crucible of consumer decision-making at the moment. The first is around pandemic cultural shifts. What this means is that consumers are inexperienced in making decisions that align to their new cultural norms and values. And that's important. The second is around essentially declining real wages. So we've got scarcity of money, which we've mentioned people are not that great at. And what we find, therefore, is that this combination of mental accounting and inexperience is amplifying our inability to not only recognise what we're actually doing, but to plan for what we need to do in the future. So in that environment, people are continuing to do what they've always done. And there's a few reasons for that and a few biases that we could jump into, as well as some cultural factors that are amplifying that effect.
Got you. So then if we've got this sort of moment in the sun where people are still, if I'm interpreting what you're saying, recalibrating to their new cultural context, what does the timeliness of this, this impending economic pressure mean for marketers and brands?
It means that now is the time.
Okay.
Essentially, the books will have to balance.
Got you.
Consumers are going to have to wake up and realise that money is a finite resource and that they are probably running out of it. This stress is already there. People are aware that they're not doing a good job. They're just not able to put the strategies in place to make the changes that they so desperately need to make. So the opportunity now is to make sure that when they get there, and I don't think it's too far away, that you have aligned to those new cultural values and you've made it really easy for them to choose you and deem you as essential. And the reason that now is a great time for that is that their mental models are up for grabs.
Yeah, got you. Given this really unique moment in time, right, where as we come out of a pandemic and we are really recalibrating these towards these new cultural norms, and then you throw in what is going to be an impending litigation of the household budget. From your perspective, what does this mean for marketers and brands?
I think there's three things here for marketers to really be aware of. The first is that your bucket is probably leaking, but so is your competitors. We've mentioned that people are trialling and switching more than ever, and those decisions are about to be consolidated as the flood comes closer and closer. So you've got to be there, you've got to be talking to them, you've got to be winning not only your own customers, but those of your competitors.
I think that's a really interesting dynamic, and you and I have discussed this a couple of times previously, but there's this interesting dynamic where you really do have to work harder to retain that customer and put yourself in that classification of I can't live without. But by the same token, to your point, there are going to be customers that have historically been unaddressable. They may have been brand loyal to other products or services or other categories, and they are in this moment of recalibration, and you have an opportunity to capture new audiences that have historically been really hard to reach.
Absolutely. There's an openness there.
Yeah, awesome.
That is a huge opportunity if you do it right.
Yeah. And so then, why act now? Why is now the moment to do so?
Because customers have really high expectations of brands at the moment, and many of them are pulling back. Now is the time to be really visible and to really start winning in the hearts and minds of customers. Their expectations are high, but the opportunity for longer-term loyalty is higher than I've seen it before. Not just in the work we've been doing, but across multiple other topics. Cost of living comes up consistently as a central concern for customers, and they expect brands to help them through it. That's the expectation. And if you do that and you forge that emotional connection with them now in their moment of distress, they are going to reward you in the longer term. So now's the moment.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, this is probably even more relevant for smaller brands, right? Where, you've got an opportunity to really get that unfair share of voice at a time where you are not necessarily competing with the full ecosystem that you would on any other given day. And there's a lot of data that shows that smaller brands get disproportionately impacted through times of economic downturn. And I think, your point is really interesting in, if you're brave enough to really lean in to capture new customers and, to your point, build that connective tissue emotionally, that can have some amazing downstream impacts, particularly when the economy comes back, and you can really capitalize on that, unfair share of voice and really capture market share from competitors that may have historically had more cash in the bank to play with.
Absolutely. But the trick will be not just doing what you've always done.
Yeah, fair enough.
And leaning into the new need and the new essential.
So you mentioned that we're really adjusting at the moment to new cultural norms and new cultural priorities. And I know from the research there were sort of 4 really interesting dynamics that are at play at the moment. I'd love for you to take our listeners and our watchers through those 4 cultural shifts that are really driving and really becoming the priority drivers for how we choose what we can and can't live without.
Yeah. So one of the biggest and almost more overarching of these themes was around the expansion and reprioritization of well-being. So the idea of wellness has moved beyond just physical and mental even. It's all about nourishment, and it encapsulates almost anything, which is great.
Anything can nourish you.
Anything can nourish you. So this idea of well-being has also moved from being something that was potentially extrinsic, so looking good at the beach, to being intrinsic, so how I feel physically in my body, how I sleep, all these sorts of things are now more important to me as the self as opposed to how I present myself to the external world. The second one is escapism. Obviously, in the pandemic, we were looking to escape. Now with all the stress that we're facing around cost of living, we're still looking to escape. And the recategorization of Netflix as a utility came out as really strong here. So the need to escape is still there. It's still really strong. And that can be fed in a number of ways. I'd say Netflix, and Netflix as the brand in particular, is the exemplar. But obviously there's travel, there's exercise could be another version of that. Yeah. There's many different manifestations of escapism.
Escaping the everyday. And I mean, we've seen this play out in the phenomenal rebound of travel, right?
Exactly.
There are some great examples of families cutting in areas that you would have historically deemed as necessities to make sure that they get that family trip once or twice a year. And I think to the point that you're making, there are some amazing opportunities for brands to start positioning their value proposition as an escapable experience.
100%. And I think, it was fascinating listening to how people have transformed post-pandemic. I think within the pandemic, Dan, you coined a term called the performative value of food in the home, which I loved, which was about us, making our lives around food that we cooked at home or, that we ordered in, whatever it was, that was the moment. Now we've seen people shift away from that to tuna and rice so that they can go overseas. Yeah. That's the priority. Millennials and Gen Z in particular are really wanting to get out there, and boomers as well. People without kids are very much focused on overseas. Those with kids tend to be more focused domestically. But it doesn't matter what it looks like. People want to get away.
Yep. The third?
Shared experiences. Again, also about travel, but about so much more than that. We've got watching parties. We've got going out with our friends, all being prioritised. Our interpersonal relationships were fundamentally impacted, obviously, by the isolation required through the pandemic to keep each other safe. And what people are looking for now is to create shared experiences to rebuild or galvanise or form new interpersonal connections that they're hungry for that.
Yeah. And finally?
Finally, the micro moment.
Ooh, okay.
Love a micro moment. So people are looking for smaller trade-offs in the day that give them a break and give them some pleasure or a release. Think the lipstick effect in other downturns, buying, a high-end lipstick is the exemplar category here, and we're seeing that come through. People are prioritizing their beauty treatments. People are prioritizing, that moment where they sit down at the pub with their friends could be one, or going and finding that great bottle of wine in the Hunter Valley instead of maybe overseas or something like that.
Yeah, life's little luxuries.
Life's little luxuries.
And what I love about these four dynamics is that they are not necessarily specific to a category. It's more around a frame of reference. And I think, there's some really interesting, there was a great phrase when I was listening to a podcast called The Uncensored CMO, where they were talking about pricing, right? And when you set your price through times of economic downturn, it's less about the price and infinitely more around the framing in which you are setting that price. And I think these four cultural shifts give us a really interesting pantry of ingredients to play with as brands in terms of understanding not just the utility of our products, but the value that is derived from the consumption experience and talking to consumers in terms of the need and the problem that you are solving for them.
Absolutely. Value is the primary need. These are the ways that you manifest that value to consumers now.
Yeah, value is becoming a much, much more abstract term.
Yes.
I want to go back a second and really talk, we're talking about this disconnect between what we say we do and more importantly, what we plan to do versus what actually manifests in human behavior and consumer behavior. And I think that this disconnect is not new, but what we're seeing is, a sustaining of it or a maintenance of it, if you will, despite the stakes getting higher in an economic climate that is becoming more and more uncertain. So I want to explore why we fail to follow through as consumers. I'm fascinated by the psychology behind this. And I'd love your perspective on why is it that, claimed behavior is becoming less and less effective as a predictor of what actually plays out for brands and consumers?
Yeah, and I think especially in this context, it's often the case, this dieting, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that happens within each context. So there's a lot that you could unpack within each decision point. But looking at it at a high level, I think that there are two key biases that are driving it, and then there's two key cultural factors that are amplifying those effects. So the first is that consumers are anchoring to lower price points. Prices are going up so quickly that they're not keeping up with that, and they're not putting in commitment strategies that deal with the actual trade-off that they're making. So they're getting to that decision point and going, oh no, it'll be fine, without realising that cocktails have gone from $17 to $25. So they're not really accounting for that properly because it's opaque for them.
And the mental model's shifting too quickly.
It's too fast.
Yep.
They can't keep up. And so that's an opportunity for brands, though, to be more transparent in that way. So there's that, which means that our commitment strategies are basically insufficient to deal with the present bias.
Yep.
So my need in this moment is winning time and time again because my commitment strategy is not sufficient to stop me because I'm not really aware of what the pain will be further down. And then I think there's the other sort of two cultural factors that are driving that are around the unconscious purchase. So there's some great work that's come out of NCAD that shows that when you pay for something, it actually activates the pain centers in your brain. The experience of that pain is lessened when you pay by card. Imagine when you're paying on your watch. As the point of payment becomes more and more seamless, the pain point is actually very far removed and can be ignored altogether. So unconscious payment is a big part of, I think, what's happening at the point of payment. And the other side of it is social facilitation. So people are, as we know, prioritising shared experience, making decisions in social contexts where they weren't having to do that before. And I think that had a lot to do with a lot of the savings as well. And so they're under this constant social pressure to spend whatever it takes to have that shared experience.
I love that. So, on the first point, what you're saying is, that the trick that Netflix knew, and they were ahead of their time in terms of the recurrent model, right? If we can figure out a way to make payment frictionless, then you can lock a consumer into a recurrent model, and then you eliminate that point of choice in terms of, will I litigate this choice on a month-in, month-out basis? And now we've got enabling technology essentially creating that same frictionless experience where we reduce the mental load on the payment and reduce the pain, which I think is an interesting underlying cognitive impact at a momentary point of choice, even if it's a single payment, within, if I'm at a particular shop or a restaurant. And then on the second, we've then got the social construct of when I'm out and I'm with my friends or family and I'm in this social context, because I have this heightened awareness and heightened investment in social dynamics of what has been for some 2 years of social starvation, my choices are skewed towards the social environment and not towards the commitments that I might have made preceding that specific moment.
Exactly.
Okay, so Rikki, we've covered off this moment in the sun for brands, right, to really get in front of consumers, particularly smaller brands that are looking, to hopefully drive growth through times of economic strife. What can we do as brands and brand marketers to preempt the flood and to really maximise our opportunities for growth as we come into a year that is looking to be more uncertain from an economic standpoint?
3 things. The first is really that fortune will favour the empathetic. So what do we mean by empathetic? We mean having truly customer-centric businesses that empathise with those customers and with the market, with the humans in the market.
Yeah, market orientation.
Exactly. And so get to know your customers, really understand them. Don't just listen to them, though. You need to know them in a way that allows you to innovate and design for them and their emerging needs. Think of COVID. Customers couldn't have told us what they needed. We needed to design for them and compete in a new environment. More than ever as well, it is tempting for us to start our town halls with our financial metrics. I'd argue now is the time to flip that and start with speaking about customers and who they are, what their needs are, giving examples of great initiatives, that sort of thing, to create that empathy and make sure that the entire organisation has a shared understanding and a shared vernacular when it comes to who the market is. So that's my first one. The second is fortune will favour the smart. And Dan, one of my favourite words is prioritisation.
I do know that well.
Very well. And now is the time more than ever to be prioritising. So we need to drive what is really important to our customers and what drives value for them and make sure that we're not spreading ourselves too thin, particularly when we're in an environment where there are supply side challenges as well. So whether that is in developing products, in delivering products, in just staff, and how we speak to our customers. And then on the other side, we've got these changing needs. So we need to be ruthless in what we deliver and how we position ourselves in the market. The final one, and I think we've touched on it a few times, is fortune will favour the visible. Put your best foot forward and start talking to the market now, before the flood. It's not the time to hide, and we need to do this in a way that gives people permission to consider your brand as essential. So think about those 4 themes. How do you align to them? And how do you then give people permission to accept your brand and enjoy you?
Rikki, thank you so much for coming to have a chat. I think, for me, there are some really illuminating insights, particularly around those cultural dynamics that are amplifying what I think the biases we tend to fall victim to. I love the idea that social facilitation is really skewing the decisions that we make, with our heightened awareness. It's been a distinct pleasure. Thank you for coming, and it's been a delight having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Dan. Always a pleasure.